Before we begin, a few updates from the world of Left Hand, Acid Horizon, and Ocular Editions. Most of those who back the campaign for Vintagia, I Ching Oracle for Psychogeography and Creative Discovery have now had their decks shipped and should receive them within the very near future, especially if you are in the United States. If you are elsewhere, be sure to keep an eye on your tracking number and check in with your local post office in case your package gets held up. This weekend, I will be finishing the last handful of shipments, and on Monday, Vintagia will officially be available to purchase online at acidhorizonpodcast.com. At the moment, both decks, Acephalus and Vintagia, are still behind a password gate. But if you are a patron of this show, Left Hand, you'll receive that password Sunday night or early Monday morning, giving you first access to the surplus copies of Vintagia available online. There will be multiple waves, so if the first sells out, stay tuned for the second. Now, Acephalus, the erotic tarot of George Bataille, will follow shortly after, available mid to late next week. Supporters here on Patreon, once again, will have first or primary access. As I have said before, this deck is not meant to be infinitely reproducible. Its presence in the world is limited. Some decks will be given away, others offered through ordeals, challenges, and perhaps even a scavenger hunt. There's a great deal to look forward to, so keep an eye out for the next Acephalus announcement coming very soon. And if you happen to be near Central Pennsylvania, we're hosting, in conjunction with Open Music, a special community event called Divining Sounds, Oracular Imagination, and Music by Chance. This gathering brings together musicians, artists, and myself to discover the oracular mechanics of Vintagia, drawing chance operations from the I Ching to generate live improvisational compositions. The event begins with an initiatory talk introducing the creative possibilities of divination, followed by a collective performance and experimentation. Tarot and I Ching readings will be offered on site, and a handful of physical copies of both Vintagia and Acephalus will be available for some form of acquisition. That's November 1st in State College, PA. The links are below. Finally, if you are anywhere near New York City, Brooklyn in particular, join us at the Durations Festival, November 5th through 9th, presented by Public Records in collaboration with Pioneer Works in the Whitney Museum of American Art. I will be appearing alongside Jason Babak Mohageg and Reza Nagaristani, alongside Meredith Graves, on Saturday, November 9th, in the event titled 5 Gates. Disquiet of the Virtual and the Artificial, a live exploration of sound, philosophy, and temporal experience. Also, be sure to join us on the Friday before, where Meredith will present a panel on philosophy and magic, where I will also attend with Phil Ford, Meg Keane, and Mitch Horowitz. Links for everything, the decks, the festival details, and tickets will all be in the show notes. Okay, on to today's episode. This is Left Hand, and I am your host, Sereptie, aka Craig of the Acid Horizon podcast. Today, I'm joined by Garett Strickland, a researcher and writer whose deep engagement with the work of Henri Michaux will guide us through one of the strangest and most arresting poetic landscapes of the 20th century. Our focus, to start out, is going to be A Certain Plume, but we are going to go other directions as well, look at some of his work that we see in Darkness Moves. But as for A Certain Plume, it is a book that reads like a series of dream reports or absurd parables, at once disarming and dark, comic, and claustrophobic. And across this conversation, we'll explore who Michaux was, the world that produced his singular vision, and how all of this opens up to a space where selfhood fractures, humor turns uncanny, and meaning always seems to slip just out of reach. So whether you're coming to Michaux for the first time or returning after many years, this is an invitation to step inside his labyrinth. Garett, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I have to tell everyone how this show came about, and it also involves a plug for our event in Brooklyn. So I have been in multiple conversations with Jason Babak Mohageg and Reza Nagaristani planning our event at the Durations Festival that goes from November 7th to 9th at Public Records in NYC. You can get tickets in the show notes. But amidst our conversations, the name Henri Michaux came up. That has a name that's always been on the periphery of some of the figures that I have dealt with, like Deleuze, Bataille, and Blanchot, and so forth. And Jason said something to me that I thought was a reason to start reading his work, which was, and we'll get into this today, which was Henri Michaux insisted never to have a photograph taken of him. And as I understand that there's like one or two like solid photographs that do float around of him, but he was very averse, if not completely antagonistic to the idea of being represented in that way. So I picked up the books, I put them on Instagram as one does and said, hey, this is what I'm reading. I'm reading for pleasure. This will not become content for either one of my shows. And Garett reached out to me and said, look, I'm probably one of the leading experts, or at least somebody in your sphere right now who's probably most well equipped to talk about Henri Michaux. Do you want to have me on the show? And I said, all right, let's do it. So Garett, thank you for taking notice of my post online. And let's find out about you first. Could you just tell us about you, Garett Strickland, your current research, and what drew you to Henri Michaux in particular? And what questions or tensions in his work continue to hold your attention?
Well, I was always really interested in the intersection between literature, writing, and metaphysics or magical practice. And I met somebody who had a copy of Darkness Moves, and I was unfamiliar with his work. I think my friend who introduced me had actually arrived at his work because musician Diamanda Galas had mentioned him. In any case, I was sort of blown away at the scope of techniques that he used. And I was really attracted to this notion of the self that he portrays as being a balance point of forces in motion in a kind of perpetual flux, and how that self is in a constant state of dissipation or being reshaped. And the writing is a kind of interior laboratory for the writer or the narrator, whose identity seems at any point to just be, a kind of ad hoc collection of forces in motion. And I thought that it's a nice way to go as far as creative writing is concerned.
Well, were there particular poems or a particular collection that you attached yourself to early on? I mean, you said you saw, or you were made aware of Darkness Moves, but was there one that stands out in your memory?
Well, Darkness Moves is interesting in that it's a anthology that covers the entirety of his career. And then there were we didn't have that many fully translated collections of his work until in the last 10 years. There have been some that came out. A Certain Plume is a more recent one. And then I think Wakefield Press put out Life in the Folds, which is another one that hadn't been translated in its entirety. A lot of there was a recent exhibition of his mescaline drawings, which a lot of people know him for his early experiments with hallucinogens and the kind of, he had himself observed. My understanding is that he was mostly a teetotaler. And so his sort of foray into mescaline and other substances, he had a doctor there observing him, at least at first, and his ability to watch his own mind and sort of report upon what's going on, as well as generating these drawings and stuff, which have been exhibited, sort of an extension of the rest of his work in terms of he's very antiseptic observer of his own imagination. I feel like. And I was impressed with the drug writings, although he wasn't having a very good time. They all have titles like Miserable Miracle or Light Through Darkness, or one of the first volumes that I encountered. It's got a great title. It's The Major Ordeals of the Mind and the Countless Minor Ones. And that was just something that was sort of around. Those books were more accessible, I think, in terms of just tracking them down. But at this point, I believe I've read almost all of the books that have been, a lot of them are out of print, but all the books that have been translated into English. But I wouldn't say that I am an expert exactly in that I'm not fluent in French. So that's a limitation, but I am familiar with the breadth of this work. And I enjoy A Certain Plume, Life in the Folds, and the prose poetry and poetry in Darkness Moves, because more so than the drug writings, which there's a lot to glean from them, I think that if you strip the context away, they read like explorations of mystical states of consciousness. You can compare them to certain of the mystic saints. I think that if you were to kind of put those things side by side, you wouldn't find that much difference between them, except the sort of chemical aspect, knowing that. But I appreciated how his themes, he wrote some travelogues, but he also wrote these imaginary travelogues. And I believe that Plume, who is his most widely known character, I guess, and I think that it sort of became his pen name, which the word plume means pin, feather, quill, kind of. It's a very on the nose pen name, I suppose. But that character has a certain Chaplin-esque and clownish aspect to him, which I think that's part of why it was a little more popular than some of his other writings. But it's an interesting juxtaposition, because the passages in A Certain Plume, the sort of series of adventures that he goes on, things are happening to him. He's pretty passive as a character, but somewhat indifferent to the things that are befalling him. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of consequence from one section to the next. And it's my understanding that Plume was sort of thrown up as an invention when he was visiting Turkey as a sort of buffer character against some of the embarrassments of day-to-day reality while he was there. And but in a lot of his other writings, he's intervening in a kind of way where you could think of it as a sorcery or a therapy that the narrator is undergoing to exact some kind of change, or it's a sort of protective magic, like an ink cloud that's being thrown up against threatening outside forces. And that's definitely different from the character of Plume, who doesn't really seem to care much about what's going on.
If you don't mind me interrupting you there, I made a connection, and maybe you can either confirm or deny this connection. Maybe there's no connection at all, but I put two and two together. But Plume sounds a lot like Bloom, and I'm thinking of Tikhon's theory of bloom. I'm not sure if you've ever dealt with that literature, but anybody who's read Tikhon, for example, will know that there's this figure named Bloom, and he's the kind of generic individual of modernity. He's alienated even from his own alienation, and he's kind of the man without qualities, but strangely somebody who stands at the threshold of liberal modernity and insurrection, the kind of smooth space of even beyond post-modernity, we might say. But there's definitely a sort of resonance or synergy there, but I don't know if you're familiar with Tikkun or not, but it seemed like they picked that name intentionally because it kind of rhymes with plume. But
I would be curious to know if they have encountered Michaux. I haven't read much of their work, but
yeah. Well, that's a call for anybody who's listening to drop into the comments, you know, how we do it here. And give us some insight on that. But yeah, actually, can you tell us a little bit about, he was actually a very well-traveled man after he wrote A Certain Plume.
There's the book on Ecuador. There's also A Barbarian in Asia, where he travels to India. I forget where else he goes. I have only read some of those texts. The funny thing, like from what I've read of Ecuador, it's like he's not really doing a lot besides like in the beginning, he's just kind of complaining about how uncomfortable he is with the travel. And it makes sense that he sort of used those experiences as a jumping off point to explore these more fantastic scenarios with these societies or creatures. I know there's a part in Darkness Moves where he's goes to some insectoid society and the sort of adventures that he has in these places. Those are quite similar to the experiences that he has in his internal. I mean, it's all this inner experience. So he encounters a lot of monsters. There's a book called Ordeals, Exorcisms that I like. It hasn't been translated in its entirety, but a lot of the poems from that and Darkness Moves are some of my favorites. But his way of encountering these things in himself are fascinating because it's not emotive writing in any way. And it doesn't really sing in the way that you think poetry might. I think even in French, it reads pretty flat, and he seems more interested in as a kind of spiritual scientist and like how efficacious is this movement in text and in his visual art too, because he was very interested in gesture and painting and that kind of thing. So
I don't know if you've ever looked at the work of James Tate or Russell Edson, but those were figures in my early brushes with high literature. But I would say James Tate especially, and then Russell Edson to a lesser extent. I see in them, they appear to me now after reading Michaux as being derivative of that. And I think Edson makes specific reference to Michaux. And so it makes me curious about how Michaux, his legacy, and maybe even the whole genre of prose poetry as we knew it in like the late 90s through the early aughts and maybe even into today was partly influenced by Michaux. And I have to say, if I would have read Michaux back in the day, it probably would have laid me to waste because I think it's more adept. It's more refined. It seems more original in a sense than even Edson and Tate. And maybe the last comment I'll make about that is, as much as I appreciate the kind of American surrealism and the deadpan irony that they introduced, that's one of the things that attracted me was this languor that exudes from Tate and Edson, we find in gallons in Michaux. But we also get this dissipative thing, this metaphysical thing that isn't as well developed in Edson and Tate.
Right, yeah. I can see the sort of through line of absurdity and humor in those writers and how appealing that probably was. There are sort of writers that foreshadowed Michaux's work. Specifically, he talked about when he encountered Lautréamont and the Chants de Mauderer, Songs of Mauderer, it really inspired him to throw himself into writing more. And that's an author who is known more by reputation, I think, than I think a lot of people know of Lautréamont without having read him, but as dark as it is, I mean, if you look at For example, if you tried to describe what was happening in parts of Mauderer to somebody, they would just be horrified you don't get any of the humor or the sort of mock heroic tone. And the humor is something that is very present in Michaux, in spite of the fact that a lot of the imagery is kind of disturbing. The self is constantly being like rended or torn or diced. It seems like there's always some sort of schism that's being traversed in most of the poems. And I think about there's one thing that he writes, I can't remember which it is, where it's just like he's growing arms and snapping them off because he's not. Yeah,
I love that one.
And they're not doing what he needs them to do, so he just keeps breaking them off until finally he's just kind of gives up, I think. But yeah, there's a sort of overall picture of, even if he didn't write explicit theory, he definitely developed a working theory in his writing and art that carries through. And there was a line that I have always liked of his, which is, like me, the line seeks without knowing what it seeks. And then later, encircling nothing, never encircled. So, and this sort of revolt is very important to him. It's like, I can't be encapsulated. I can't be defined, not in a kind of I contain multitudes sort of way, which we hear that, the Whitman quote, and it sounds so boisterous, like, oh, good for me. But Michaux said, I spit on my life. I dissociate myself from it. So he didn't really honor a sense of identity. He definitely was very alienated and solipsistic and solitary. And I think that's kind of what provided a rich inner life, which is a dichotomy that is familiar, but I don't know if anybody has really dove in quite the way that he has. So
Labyrinth. Life, a labyrinth. Death, a labyrinth. Labyrinth without end, says the master of Ho. Everything hammers down, nothing liberates. The suicide is born again to new suffering. The prison opens on a prison. The corridor opens another corridor. He who thinks he is unrolling the scroll of his life is unrolling nothing at all. Nothing comes out anywhere. The centuries, too, live underground, says the master of Ho. In fact, the poem In Darkness Moves that really stood out to me, I also posted on the Acid Horizon Instagram, which was Labyrinth. And because we are doing Acephalus, the erotic tarot of George Bataille, and we have a compendium that's coming with that. And by the way, I get emails every day. You can't imagine how slammed my inbox is, people asking for this deck, and there's only going to be like 250 extra copies. We're not trying to make it a commodity. We want it to be this like sort of like one-off thing, and there's going to be a lot of sad people. But anyway, the reason I bring it up now is for the compendium, I wrote about the labyrinth, because we see the labyrinth in Bataille's work, we see it in the work of Deleuze. It seems that in the tradition of French philosophy, and maybe even philosophy like Nietzsche, just broadly, continental philosophy, the labyrinth becomes a meditation of sorts. And so I was interested to see what Michaux's take on it was. But what struck me was it resonates with this impulse that, I mean, we can say in a sort of very banal way that, like Foucault, everything is a prison. But Michaux says everything is a labyrinth in the sense that labyrinths open onto other labyrinths. There is no finality. There is no resolution. There's only this complex implication forevermore unto death. And,
Right.
and with Michaux, it seems very solipsistic. I don't want to take the whole episode on a tangent based on part 2 of A Certain Plume, but the meditation that we get in part 2 in particular shows, and this is something that you mentioned earlier, just a very attentive form of introspection to the way that his psyche just inhabits his imaginative ecology, the way that he's drawn out, pushed in, the way that he might be tempted by things like ideologies or stable identities, stable essences, avoiding them. It's a very sort of intricate and I guess you would say a cartography, kind of cast in sharp relief of what it looks like to be a self that's constantly unselfing.
Yeah, it's very uncomfortable, and it's strange that somebody so fluid and porous has their hackles go up quite as much. I mean, he becomes, as he gets older, sort of more attracted to the Zen kind of side of things. He's a little bit more peaceable as he goes on. There was a book called Tent Posts that Green Integer published that is basically like almost like they're like posts, so almost like tweets or something, very small texts that are kind of like advice that your uncle might give you, but like razzing you at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, idiot, like here's what you need to
wait,
do.
what's the name of the text again?
It's called Tent Posts. That's another like collection of, I think he wrote them pretty late in his life, but it's he's a little less sort of turbulent by that point. But yeah, there's a kind of constant renegotiation of boundaries in the work, and he's able to sort of take the scalpel of his writing and pull himself into pieces and set those pieces against themselves. And there's a lot of like sort of imagery of like, when I think of his work, I was thinking about that description. It's like Hegel's Night of the Worlds, where there's like the figure of the bloody head and the like rising up out of the dark. And he's always sort of describing these shapes emerging from darkness, or like astral larvae or something, that kind of proliferation of things.
There's a lot of weird pronoun agreement too that makes you have to reread things a few times, like who did what was the action there, and it's confusing, but then when you realize it's kind of a stylistic choice, it sets a little bit better. Well, here's a question. When I think of somebody like Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, bombastic in the texts, but it was said by people who knew him, he was a very kind, gentle, the kind of person who tried to extricate himself from any tendency of cruelty. But then in the texts, we see this bombastic figure. With Michaux, we talked about just a little bit his aversion to publicity, his aversion to commodification of his works, and so forth. How was he in public life? And maybe how did he evolve over time? Is he someone who kind of fell into madness? Did he grow more comfortable with his hallucinations and his intensive journeys, if you will?
I think that, from what I can tell, to give you just sort of some idea of his history, he was born in 1899 in Belgium. He relocated to Paris and was naturalized there eventually in 1924. And he was friends with certain influential artists and writers. I know the artist Paul Klee did some portraits of him. He was friendly, I think, with the Surrealist group without ever being interested in joining, because he wasn't a fan of ideology, or anything with a manifesto probably wasn't going to be of interest to him. But he shared space in the journals at the time that the Surrealists were published in, and would exhibit his artwork in galleries. But his refusal, and I think that it would be fair to describe him as like a poet of refuse in more than one sense. Apparently there's a collection of letters that's just him saying no to stuff, like invitations to exhibit work or accept awards. He turned down a prestigious award. I can't remember which one, but I think this sort of idea that he was a hermit or something like that. I mean, he wasn't. There are some pictures of him hanging out with, there's some event where Nabokov is there and he's there as well. But yeah, he didn't like to be photographed. There's not a lot of evidence of what his social life was like. I think he just liked to stay at home and paint. And there's a suggestion that he improvised music on piano as well, though there are no reportings of it. But he had this kind of idea of gesture that exists as much in his painting and drawing. He's one of the, like, historically speaking, he's one of the most popular proponents of asemic writing and painting. You could kind of, compare him to Cy Twombly or one of these artists who worked with mark making extensively. And he was very interested in Chinese calligraphy, and he started experimenting with signs, semiotics, because at some point he found that language was not cut out for poetry, which is interesting.
Yeah, quite a claim.
Yeah.
In the night, in the night, in the night, I have united with the night, the endless night with the night. Mine, queen, queen of mine, night, night of birth, filling me with my cry, my flowering spikes. You invading me with howl, howl, swells, all over ocean swells, smoking dense and bellowing, are the night. Here lies the night, relentless night, and its brass band, and its beach above, its beach all over, its beach drinking, with its weight king, sinking things beneath it, beneath thinner than a thread, beneath the night, the night. I just looked it up online. He refused the Grand Prix National de Lettres in 1965, offered by the French Ministry of Culture, and then also membership in the Belgian Academy of Language and Literature in his homeland. And one of the reasons that he cites is he refused to identify with any sort of national affiliation, which kind of leads us to the question of, did he have a politics, or did he eschew politics completely? Was he ever involved or on the fringe of any political movements? I mean, clearly he grew up through the war, so what was he doing at that time?
Yeah, there are a couple things that he wrote during the Nazi occupation that kind of give you some sense of what his politics might be like, which I kind of get the impression that he was mostly egalitarian in his view of things. But I'm going to read this piece called Voices, which he wrote during the war, and might give you some kind of idea of that. I heard a voice in those unhappy days, and I heard, I shall reduce them, these men. I shall reduce them, and already they are reduced, although they don't realize it yet. I shall reduce them to so little that there will be no way telling man from woman, and already they are no longer what they once were. But since their organs can still interpenetrate, they still think themselves different. This one this, the other that. But so terribly shall I make them suffer that there will no longer be any organ that matters. I shall leave them only their skeletons, a mere line of their skeleton for them to hang their unhappiness on. They've run enough. What do they still need legs for? Their movements are small, and it will be much better that way. Just as a statue in a park makes only one gesture, whatever may happen, even so shall I petrify them, but smaller. I heard that voice. I heard it and I shuddered, but not all that much, because I admired it for its dark determination and its vast, though apparently senseless plan. That voice was only one voice among hundreds, filling the top and bottom of the atmosphere and the east and the west, and all of them were aggressive, wicked, hateful, promising a sinister future for man. But man, panicky in one place, calm in another, had reflexes and calculations in case of hard times, and he was ready, although he might generally have appeared hunted and ineffectual. He who can be tripped up by a pebble had already been walking for 200,000 years when I heard the voices of hatred and threats which meant to frighten him.
Yeah, fantastic. Michaux seems to fall in the tradition of thinking against the organic structuration of an organism, much like Artaud in a way. There's definitely a sort of resemblance there. And then we can see this sort of translated into or filtered through the philosophies of Deleuze and Guattari somewhat, who held Michaux in high regard. Let's talk about philosophers. I mean, and maybe even your work a little bit more. In your engagement with Michaux, are you dealing with philosophers and their interpretations? And what did Michaux's contemporaries say about him? And how has his legacy persisted or been transformed by subsequent interpretations?
Well, I've read some secondary literature. I mean, a lot of these writers, I'm thinking specifically about Bataille, Blanchot, Klossowski, all wrote about each other pretty extensively. I know that Blanchot has a monograph of writings about Michaux, and there's an essay of his that's been translated in his collection, Death Now, I think. I haven't read that essay, but I have occasionally tried to do some amateur translation. I think that there are affinities between Henri Michaux and Maurice Blanchot that should probably be explored further. They were both kind of interested in the author's disappearance, at least publicly. They weren't interested in the kind of cult of personality that some of their other contemporaries were happy with. Bataille and Blanchot were good buddies, but we don't have a lot of accounts of them hanging out at cafes together or anything like that. So, but I place Michaux in that group of thinkers in my imagination, and my own research into those writers has sort of held him and those figures in tandem. Pierre Klossowski in particular seemed similar to Michaux in that they had an idea of writing and art as exorcism. And I think that's, and Deleuze too, the sort of Deleuzian sorcerer.
Sure, yeah.
I feel like that's...
Oh, absolutely. My blood. The broth of my blood through which I trudge is my bard, my wool, my women. It is without scabs. It is enchanted, free to flow. It fills me with stained glass windows, bits of granite, shards. It tears me apart. I live amid its splinters. Within my coughs, my terrors, and my trances, it constructs my castles in the webs and weaves and stains. It illuminates. He's probably paradigmatic as the becoming sorcerer figure in a sense. Well, that raises a question, because between going backwards from like Deleuze to Blanchot. We can even throw Baudrillard in there, who basically said that one of the most difficult things in this world was to disappear. Of course, we think of Deleuze and Guattari's becoming imperceptible, and then the dissipative writings of Michaux here. If we were to rate Michaux against these other figures, or just in general, to what extent was he successful, do you think, in his own project in fending off the forces of categorical enclosure, metaphysical enclosure that many of these French authors were fighting against?
Well, it's funny because I think of him as being very effectual in that warding off, and that he sort of demonstrates a theory without writing essays about theory. It's like in critical writings, I think too often, and there might be something lost in translation. I mean, one thing that's so fun as an American reading French theorists is how flagrant and declarative they are, and willing to use poetic language to demonstrate their thought, where sometimes you have essays written about very interesting concepts that don't enact those concepts in any way. So the sort of membrane of categorization in French between critical theory and poetic texts is more porous. You can kind of slip from one to the other more easily. And I mean, there was a time in France where critical theory was the most popular form of writing, ahead of fiction or poetry. The average person was reading critical text, and which is it. We can't really imagine it now, at least not in the US. But if you're looking at a kind of like show, don't tell paradigm, Michaux carried that really well. And he would occasionally give a prologue or an epilogue sort of explaining his technique or what the ideas were that inspired a series of a poetic text.
When I read Michaux, and all of these figures, in fact, but Michaux in particular, in A Certain Plume, we see a kind of quiet violence or an absurd kind of suffering. And sometimes we see very explicit violence, like the poem or the passage that stands out there is the mass murder of the Bulgarians on the train, if you remember.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I mean, today, some of that language would be considered problematic. I mean, even there's a sort of mild Orientalism that we get in some of the things in Darkness
Right.
Moves too. But despite that, or maybe even somewhat because of that, because I think Michaux's aware of his irony. It comes somewhat par-baked. He knows what he's up to, I believe. And reading this kind of poetry for me, it feels nostalgic because like I said, I attached myself to these other poets in the past. And I would say, if you want to talk about magic, we were talking about magic a little bit before we start. I think there is, these kinds of prose poems are invocative in a way. Even the way that they kind of fall on the page has this capacity, as I see it, to sort of disrupt the ordinary flow of sociality, kind of tamper with everyday rituals in a way. And when you read yourself and immerse yourself in this kind of literature, I do think it gives you some leverage on like modern life and subjectivity. That's one of the reasons, like, coming into Michaux, it's almost like having a tryst with this kind of discourse or non-discourse in a way. But then I find myself back in the grind, doing the podcast. Welcome to Left Hand. You know what I mean? But it reminds me of a time in my life where the stakes were higher if I didn't have a job or something like that. But I would get so into this stuff and it felt very transformative for me. And so I'm wondering what it would be like to be an Henri Michaux today with all of the trappings of modern or postmodern life and the way that subjectivity or the apparatuses of subjectivation, if you will, are ever more intense. I wonder if you have any thoughts in that vein.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about what somebody like Michaux might think of the internet. I've thought.
Chat GPT.
Oh, yeah. I mean, who knows? I always thought that Samuel Beckett is somebody who would really appreciate the internet.
Sure.
I think that Beckett's sense of humor is in line with Michaux's as well.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
But this kind of no place or void that he seems to be writing from or occupying a lot of the time, he's sort of suspended in an abyss. And that's another affinity, I think, from that he has with Blanchot's like fictional writings, his recites, is that they kind of swallow themselves in a way. But you get to the end of a Michaux poem and something has occurred, although you wouldn't really be able to say what, like whether it's been effective in its apotropaic magic where you're like, well, I'm going to cast a spell to keep anybody from casting a spell on me. I mean, he has a few in Darkness Moves. There are some maledictions and a benediction as well. But I mean, there's kind of recourse to protect the self at all costs is also a humorous posturing for somebody who is as fluid and sort of protean in their view of what constitutes the self. And we have so much, like, certainly not going to soapbox about it or anything, but I think that Michaux is somebody who is refreshing now, in particular, when we're so like inundated with identity politics, because he's kind of constantly stripping away this like carapace, and then, you know, that something hardens that could be called an identity, and he's like, fuck this, not interested in that at all.
I have complicated thoughts about that, just generally speaking, but I think it's funny because there's a kind of caricature raised of identity politics that I think ultimately belies the source of, like, if we want to call French philosophy and French literature one of the sources, as it is often pointed to as being a problem, like postmodernism caused all of this. Well, if you look close, what Michaux is saying about identity is not like what we see in the popular political sphere at all. We all stand to take a lesson. I mean, that said, struggles for liberation, I think they still go on. But, you know, maybe even Michaux would have problems with that, the way that those sorts of things coalesce programmatically. And he's always going to want to find these lines of flight. And I really like what you said there at the end, that you come out the back end of one of these poems almost like you tumbled down a slide or something. You just don't know how it is that you're supposed to feel. But it's not done in the name of a kind of violence or cruelty to the individual, because I think there is a kind of enjoyment or whirlwind even amidst the discombobulation. At least that's the way that I read it anyway.
And Plume is like these things that the character undergoes. It's like, or any of his narrators, really, this notion of a buffer character, these characters traveling through fantastic lands. It's like they're sort of suffering or enjoying things on his behalf, right? As its author, who he's got this kind of, I would say that there's a sort of quasi-divine immunity that he has, where Michaux, as multiplicitous as he is in any of these texts, is this sort of immovable force who doesn't seem very bothered by these violences that are being inflicted or that he's inflicting. There's like a really funny prose poem about him massaging important figures into sausages and keeping them in his basement.
Wait, that isn't A Certain Plume.
I'm not sure if that one is The Sausage Seller, but I mean, but there's a lot of things like, so one of my favorite prose poems from Darkness Moves I wanted to read.
Go for
because
it.
I feel like it encapsulates a lot. It's called A Dog's Life. I always go to bed very early, dead tired, and yet you couldn't find any tiring work in the course of my day. Maybe you couldn't find any. But what surprises me is that I can hang on till evening and that I'm not forced to get into bed by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. What tires me out like that are my continual interventions. I've already said that in the street I fight with everybody. I slap some man, grab women's breasts, and using my foot as a tentacle, I sow panic in the cars of the metro. As for books, they harass me more than anything else. I just can't leave a word with its original meaning or even its form. I catch it, and after a few tries, I uproot it and lead it definitively away from the author's flock. There may easily be thousands of sentences in a chapter, and I've got to sabotage every one of them. It is absolutely essential to me. Occasionally, certain words remain like towers. I have to go about it a few times, and then, when my demolition has already gone pretty far, all of a sudden, while passing by an idea, I can see that tower again. So, I hadn't knocked it down enough. I have to go back and find the poison for it, and I spend an endless amount of time in this way. And once the whole book has been read, I lament, for I haven't understood a thing, naturally. Couldn't enhance myself with anything. I stay thin and all dried up. I used to think that when I had destroyed everything, I would be well adjusted, right? Maybe, but it's long in coming. It's really long.
You know, what's amazing about that is, you know, we talked about his intense self-awareness at a very basic ethical or metaphysical level. We all carry statements within ourselves. And sometimes these statements are wards against or redoubts against certain forces, or they enclose us in a way that gives us a sense of self-certainty. And he observes himself in the poem that you just read as essentially making no progress, just kind of ambulating this empty core of himself. But even at the end, in the final lines, what were the final lines again?
I used to think that when I had destroyed everything, I would be well adjusted, right? But it's long in coming. It's really long. That's
what I love, is that even knowing or wishing or invoking the sort of destructive quality of Michaux's brand of poetry, or even the sort of anti-metaphysics we might say that he's broadly associated with, there is a sense at the end of a kind of skepticism or doubt, like, okay, even though I destroyed all those things, the way that I read it was there a secret longing to be made whole even by that?
Right.
I love that level of introspection.
Yeah, that you could like razz everything to the ground in a scorched earth in one's imagination in an effort to rebuild the self and then come away completely impoverished.
Right, exactly. and maybe even identifying with that impoverishment and in the sort of inverted way, I destroyed everything. Well, you're not getting the satisfaction from that either. So There's a way that the self always kind of sneaks itself in there. But I would ask this. So I picked up Darkness Moves. We talked about it beforehand. Mm-hmm. It's expensive, even used. I found a very cheap copy. I was very lucky to have found it. And then you directed me to the NYRB, New York Review of Books, A Certain Plume, which is a very handsome pocket volume. So if you want to get started with Henri Michaux, this is a good one. Darkness Moves has, as we said, it's the anthology. I think NYRB has at least one more like chapbook or selections by him, correct?
I think that they put out Miserable Miracle.
That's right.
And that's there are reproductions in that one of his masculine drawings that he did along with those experiments. I think another volume to pick up would be Life in the Folds, which Wakefield Press, it's a wonderful press, published. And that both of those books they both demonstrate very well the sort of notion of intervention that we were talking about before. There's a kind of Life in the Folds involves, as we're talking about writing as a sorcery or a therapy, there's also kind of weaponization. It's like he's crafting some magical tool. I think that there are chapters like the slapping gun or something like that, or apartment thunder, which is like something that he is like, oh, the kids across the street in the playground are making too much noise. So I'm going to like make a storm happen in my apartment to kind of combat it or something. it's funny because when he's talking very plainly in certain essays about these interventions, he's like, it says something about having a headache and like where he places himself in his own head as though he were going and standing in one spot in order to kind of combat this overall ailment. And he's like, after 4 or 5 hours, I feel fine. It's like, okay. Like, maybe you would have anyway. I don't know if your magic is working in this particular case, but
we've talked so much about magic now. Is this part of your PhD research? Are you trying to connect magical thinking with Michaux's work?
Well, I mean, I guess I've given myself a PhD. I don't really have formal education. I'm proudly autodidactic, which also makes me uniquely qualified to talk about fellow autodidacts like Michaux, I guess. But I am definitely into intervention and gesture that I find efficacious. So his writing is very present tense in a way that I appreciate. I like texts that do things, and I like analyzing what is being performed or what's being done. And you definitely have that in a sort of tradition of magical texts where you're going on a journey or you're departing the self in a sort of ascent or descent or concomitant vertical movement. That sort of whirling of forces, the dispersions or sort of concretizations that occur in Michaux are things that I've observed in other metaphysical texts. So I place himself, I place, and that's a funny way of saying it, in that tradition. And I think that that's one thing that he is very generous with. I mean, I don't know how intentional it was on his own part, but you can view him through a lens of literature and poetics as much as a kind of spiritual science, or he's a metaphysician, certainly. I think the way that he performs his ideas kind of proves that in a way. And whether you're looking at the visual art that he made or through the drug experiments or whatever, the sort of acts of unselfing or an effort to get at something more essential in the self, such as it is admirable. And you see that through his revolt against categorization as much as anything else. So,
yeah, I think one of the reasons that I decided to cleave pretty close to his work after Jason's mention in my recent conversation was he seemed to be an example of the very thing he tried to incarnate in the world. And you can't say that about every philosopher necessarily. Like even Artaud, to a certain extent, failed in his mission. But no, this was a great conversation. I really appreciate you reaching out to me, Garett. Any plans for some work in the future, a book, papers? What is it that you are working on?
Yeah, I have published, most recently, last year, I published a book of asemic work, sort of inspired, called A Place Beyond, which is definitely informed by his sort of philosophy of mark making and also sharing a sort of dissatisfaction with the written text as something, at least in this particular case, that was sort of too fixed and not serving the dynamism that I wanted for that particular project. But I think I have no specific plans for a monograph on Michaux, but his sort of working philosophy is something that has shaped very deeply all of my own work. And in both of my books, Ungula being the the first one that was published in 2020. Both of those books are through Inside the Castle, kind of limited print run, but I think that they might both be available through Asterism. So, but I developed a sort of twin-headed philosophical project called Ordealism and Liminalogy. And at very least, the Ordealism side of things, I would say that Michaux is kind of the grandfather of that, which as soon as you set a goal for oneself, you divide the self in half and kind of throw part of yourself into the future. And you're like, okay, I got to get over there. But just as much as it's a goal, it's an obstacle. So negotiating that sort of interior landscape is a project that I've stayed with in any of the narrative work that I've done, which I think is really side effect in some way to narrativity. I think that's sort of why in his Plume writings, more things are happening to Plume rather than him as a sort of demiurgic narrative force. In some of his other works are sort of, he's like, here's what I'm going to make happen, or here's what I'm trying to make happen, and then goes about failing over and over again. Or so, but I think that as soon as you sort of create the trappings of a story, you invite things to befall a character. And it's like a kind of long pratfall that occurs.
And that's an interesting paradox too. To be an author, in the case of Michaux, is to sort of open this aperture of a character or an anti-character to whom everything happens to. In a sense, they are forced to become transformed by every event. And part of the artistry is to see, in a way it seems passive, but what is the active element but holding the portal open and foreclosing paths that lead into little eddies that we can never get out of? Like, that's where the magic is. Like, how can we keep the flow alive in the case of Plume?
You mentioned a portal. So I have a Substack called Portology, and I kind of, a lot of my ongoing explorations can be charted through that Substack. So
great. We'll put the Substack and the publications in the show notes, and people can check them out if copies are still available. Great. Well, Garett, thank you very much.
Oh, and feel free to to write Asterism and demand, if you can't find copies of my book, suggest that more be printed. Yeah. So, well, I'll put shameless self-promotion. Sorry.
I will put an Asterism comment in there too. I asked Asterism if they would carry some of Ocular Editions, the imprint that we're trying to create. We were refused, but granted, we didn't have any publications out yet, but they are here now. So if anyone from Asterism is listening, we got the goods. Garett, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And as I said, for those of you who are listening to Left Hand now, there has been a slight content gap, but it's for good reasons, because most of you will be getting Vintagia or the Acephalus deck, the Erotic Tarot of George Bataille, all coming soon. Some of them are in the mail now. Others are going out right after I hang up the phone with Garett here. So this has been a great conversation.
Yes. Thanks again for having me.
At rest in misfortune. Misfortune, my great plowman. Misfortune, take a seat. Take a rest. Let's both take a rest, you and me. Take a rest. You find me, remind me, incline me. I am your ruin. My great theater, my harbor, my hearth, my cellar of gold, my future, my true mother, my horizon. In your light, in your scope, in my dread, I give up.